Today's episode of Lions of Liberty is brought to you by MathBot.com. MathBot.com is a fun little game that fills a serious hole that the public and even the private schools miss, and that is knowledge of programming and the math behind programming. MathBot.com gives parents a much-needed tool to make sure their children don't fall behind in this new information age. Software is eating the world, and those who don't know how to code will be left behind as more and more jobs become automated. MathBot.com gives kids and even adults like me the knowledge needed to thrive in this new world. MathBot may just seem like a fun and simple game, but behind the scenes it uses the same method Julius Caesar, Isaac Newton, Einstein, and everyone else were all taught math before the state got its greasy hands into education. This method goes all the way back to classical Greece, the dawn of civilization. MathBot will gradually upload the math and logical skills needed to understand programming into the mind of any player. It's said that the pen is mightier than the sword, but now code is even mightier than the pen. So become mighty and learn to code over at mathbot.com.
Welcome to the Lions of Liberty podcast. Here's your host, your guide, your shining beacon of liberty, Marc Claire.
Hello, and welcome back to your favorite libertarian podcast that you are currently listening to. That's right, it's Lions of Liberty, and this is our flagship program where every single Monday I host interviews with some of the greatest minds in the libertarian movement. Like the one you're going to hear today, I often also host roundtable discussions over a few adult beverages like we did last week in our very popular segment that we like to call Libertarians in Living Rooms Drinking Liquor. Be sure to check that out. We did a nice little President's Day special, drunkenly discussing the best and worst presidents through the libertarian lens. So be sure to click back in your feed to episode 388 and check that out. And that, of course, means that this is the 389th episode of the flagship Lions of Liberty podcast, which means you can find today's show notes over at lionsofliberty.com/389. It's not just me here, though, at Lions of Liberty. We have the greatest libertarian podcast variety show you have ever rewarded your ears by listening to. And the variety comes in starting on Wednesdays, where Brian McWilliams brings you his weekly shot of comedy, culture, and liberty on Electric Liberty Land. And we even seem to have spin-offs within spin-offs now, because Brian is now also producing the hilarious audio piece of comedic brilliance known as Do Nothing Man. That is a new series that's going to be exclusively for our patrons. But there will, I believe, if he is feeling kind, be a special preview coming out soon for the regulars, the normies out here. Of course, we don't just beg and plead for you to come over to Patreon and send us money and help support and grow this program. We reward you. We see it as a free market exchange, and we give you a ton, and I really do mean a ton of bonus content. Brian's show, Do Nothing Man, tons of bonus segments with guests. I'll hop on there and do Ask Me Anythings all the time. We also have, the League of Liberty podcast with myself, Chris Spangle, Roger Paxton, and Johnny Adams of Blast Off, as well as a rival program known as the Legion of Liberty Doom. This will all make so much more sense to you if you just check out our Patreon for as little as $5 a month. Head on over to patreon.com/Lions of Liberty. But back to this program, because we don't have enough to promote here. Back to this program, I also want to make sure you do check out John Odermatt every single Friday with his weekly look at the broken criminal justice system on Felony Friday. This show is always hard-hitting and is an absolute can't miss. You get all this stuff, at least the three main programs, for free, 3 days a week, every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, by clicking that subscribe button. Without further ado, friends, let's get to my much-awaited guest today. My guest today is the editor-at-large at Reason Magazine. He is one of the hosts of the excellent podcast called The Fifth Column. His writing has been seen in the LA Times as well as many other publications over the years, while he has also appeared as a pundit on MSNBC and other mainstream media outlets, including a run as the co-host of the very sadly now defunct The Independents on Fox Business. I met him very briefly at the LNC last June, but I'm very pleased to welcome him here to Lions of Liberty for the very first time. He is the one and only Matt Welch. Matt, are you ready to roar?
That was a gamble to see whether that thing was in tune. It's close enough.
That was the first instrumental affirmation of roaring I've ever gotten. I'm very impressed. And I had Jordan Page on the show a couple weeks ago, and even he didn't strum a guitar. So very impressed. Very impressed.
Here for it.
All right, Matt. So, why don't we start out at the beginning since your first time on the show here? When did your political views sort of first begin to take shape, and how do they evolve that you now find yourself embracing the term libertarian, serving as the editor-at-large at Reason Magazine? Take us on a little bit of this journey here.
So I'm from Southern California in the aerospace belt. My dad was an aerospace engineer. My stepdad was an aerospace engineer. And so I kind of grew up in the beautiful fiery sun of the late Cold War and had as an intrinsic value that commies sucked and Ruski commies were the worst. So, and that capitalism was a great and good thing. And even though I wouldn't put it this way, kind of a moral good, like it's a better way to have things organized and not having the state in the middle of everything. And that was kind of in the water where I drank. I probably started to become a little bit more politically aware as a teenager when I kind of worked my way back through the new journalism of the 1960s and the early 1970s, kind of Hunter Thompson, Tom Wolfe, a lot of the anti-authoritarian, super creative, very independent bent and civil libertarian minded journalism there, which got me into the kind of politics and great disillusionments that happened in the 60s and 70s. Of course, I'm born in 1968, so it's a lot of this is science fiction to me, and recent science fiction, but still nonetheless. And I was fascinated by it, and this kind of got me into these areas of thought. The civil libertarian, like Nat Hentoff, the Village Voice, the 1980s, I read when I was working at my college newspaper, that always made the most sense to me of just, hey, look, the ends don't justify the means. Here is how you have to do it. Defend the Nazis' right to march, the bastards, they're a bunch of a-holes, but you have to defend their right to march. That's how we do it on a constitutional system if we're going to take this stuff seriously. That always made a ton of sense to me. So this was kind of my built-in set of values as 18-year-old, 19-year-old, 20-year-old. And then in 1990, at about the time that I would have graduated from college if I had not been expelled for bad grades, I decided, and so did a lot of my friends, to move to Central Europe, which had just opened up for the first time. It was an undifferentiated black hole for my entire childhood. And then suddenly everything changes. Communism collapses. There are these countries that we'd never heard of before opening up, and they're beautiful and they're great. Let's go look at them and roll around. So I was fortunate enough, and that's really an understatement, to move out of that part of the world 9 months after the Berlin Wall fell, and ended up in Prague, ended up starting the region's first independent post-communist English language newspaper with some friends. And so I saw the wreckage of totalitarianism and of communism and covered those transitions up close, which got me into other writings of especially Václav Havel, but also just kind of the anti-authoritarian, anti-totalitarian writings of Central Europe, which had a huge, profound impact on me. And so, and as did the notion that, and this is kind of a paradox, that ideology is oftentimes your enemy, not your friend. And this is something I've been grappling with my life as a libertarian, is because libertarianism is an ideology. So how do you deal with that?
Do you mean that sort of from a journalistic perspective, or just in a perspective overall of trying to communicate with people in the world? Your ideology is sort of always going to butt its way in there and cause issues.
Journalistic for the most part. As soon as I took one step into my college newspaper in September of 1986, at the age of 18, I was like, okay, I got it. This is what I'm doing. And so I've been fascinated with the concept of truth. Václav Havel put it as living in truth, or living within the truth. And he was constantly talking about this. George Orwell, who's a big influence on Havel and also on me and everyone else, was always talking about this, the distorting lens of ideology and on kind of a will to power that causes people to lose their own sense of, being able to accurately point out the nose in front of your own face, in Orwell's phrasing, but also the way that gets used by statist and totalitarian systems to enforce orthodoxy and obedience among captive populations. These are the great questions of kind of 20th century anti-totalitarian thought and writing. And so that had a very strong influence on me. I come back to the States in 98. And I start gravitating towards libertarian orbits, partly because I couldn't believe that we had won the Cold War without ever having had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission among ourselves, the people who were fighting amongst each other over the Cold War all those years. Lefties were bad apologists for Sandinistas, and righties were bad apologists for South Africa apartheid regime. And you thought there'd be hey, you know what? Sorry, my bad. I went too far in this direction. And, you know what? I went too far. None of that happened. So
maybe we can all relax and get along now.
Or do a searing sense of self-inventory and say, where were my habits of mind wrong? Where did I injure another person? Or where did I misrepresent people? Where did I make a mistake? As a journalist, I'm constantly haunted about this. What if I am wrong? What if this one word, this description is wrong? This terrifies me. And I was disappointed to see that in American politics, none of that work was happening. And so I gravitated over towards libertarians. And this is where, this is an ideology too. But part of the ideology for me, which makes it interesting, is that part of its tool utility to me personally more than, let's say, the broader world of libertarianism. I use it as a journalistic tool. I think it's great to do political journalism from a libertarian point of view, especially if it's local reporting. My God, it's a great analysis. It's an analysis of power structures, right? And it's a built-in kind of skepticism, and it also makes the point. This is something I've made a lot in my writing, is that the very people who are loudest about not being ideological, not being partisans, I'm just here solving problems. They oftentimes have the biggest ideology among everybody and power. So I love grappling with this kind of stuff. So long, weird answer, but that's how I got here.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like often those that believe themselves to be the most unbiased are really just so biased towards their own ideology that they believe it to not even be biased. They believe it to just be the truth. Therefore, in their minds, they seem to actually be able to justify that they're being unbiased in their, what is obvious to anyone that doesn't share their view, very biased, quote unquote, journalism.
This goes into so much of the constant kind of misunderstanding or disconnect between journalists, particularly at places that try to uphold some kind of sense of fairness, and journalists' audience. And I've been writing and talking about this for 32 years, and it's really hard to get my colleagues at newspapers to kind of see that, hey, look, you're swimming in water. You might not feel it. You've been in that water your whole life, but that's water. And it has a certain temperature and tactility that's noticeable to other people. And even if your own motives in your own brain are pure, and I hope they are, I think it is really good to try to be as fair-minded as possible and as thoroughgoing and all that kind of stuff. These are good values. I don't want to see those values go away. But that doesn't mean that you close ranks when someone, especially if they're a little bit unwashed around the edges and crude in their critiques, say, hey, look, you're all a bunch of biased people. And then I say to those people making those critiques, don't confuse bias with an agenda. Those are two very different things. And it's been a losing battle for media literacy on all fronts in my life. I wrote my first sort of regular thing for Reason was I wrote a media column for them. And I've written media columns and participated in that kind of stuff. I used to write for the Online Journalism Review, Columbia Journalism Review, I think American Journalism Review, all this stuff for a really long time. And I've kind of, I guess the fifth column is kind of a media criticism podcast in many ways that I participate in with my colleagues Camille Foster and Michael Moynihan and Anthony Fisher. So I still kind of do that, but I do that less than I used to because at some point I'm more interested in just kind of covering news rather than constantly trying to spread media literacy in a climate where people kind of want to retreat into mutual hostility faster on really all sides.
When I was in college, I actually began by studying journalism. And one of the things that I was told in my classes was kind of referencing what we were discussing before is that you're supposed to be very unbiased. You're supposed to look at everything right down the middle. And I remember that just me thinking to myself, well, that's just ridiculous. So we all have biases. To me, it's dishonest to sort of just pretend that everything is coming from an unbiased perspective. The honest thing to do is to really reveal your biases and then say, here's the perspective that I have. have. Here's why I hold this certain perspective. And I quickly lost interest in journalism from an academic perspective. I guess I always maintained the interest, and that's maybe in some ways what led to doing this podcast. But you mentioned that earlier that you were expelled from college for bad grades. So it seems like you lost a little bit of interest from the academic aspect of it as well. So I'm wondering if we could take back to that a little bit and explore that. What was it about the academic side of things that you either, you weren't excelling at, you didn't take interest in it, or what have you? But obviously it seems that being expelled was maybe the best thing to happen to you, because it did lead to the rest of your journalistic career.
Well, I should point out that UC Santa Barbara, where I went to school at the time, had one of the 5 or so best college newspapers in the country. And it was 5 days a week then. And one of its greatest characteristics was that it was completely untethered to any single journalism class or program or adults or anything like that. It's because almost totally perpetuated by the students themselves and trying to figure out and hand down knowledge and spread it and all that kind of stuff. So, I walked in there and I was blown away, and I worked my tail off and became assistant news editor at age 18, which hadn't happened before, I think. And I just stopped going to class. So it wasn't really, it wasn't a big mystery.
A self-expulsion.
It turns out if you actually don't attend class, you will fail them. And that if you fail enough classes, the university is less interested in keeping you around. So I ended up spending a year there before they kicked me out. Spent a couple of years in summer school there. The last 2 years, and then one kind of fallen year in between a couple of community colleges. The last 2 years of what I would refer to as my college experience, I worked at the same paper, but they had a handful of university paid positions. So I was doing typesetting for the paper. So putting it to bed every night, paste up and typesetting and all this kind of stuff. The dark arts that have mostly been lost ever since. But I was basically working with my same friends on the same paper, and I was influencing the journalism of it in addition to the production of it. So I was doing the thing that I loved, and I was not going to chemistry classes, which I don't love, but I also had, I'd screwed up. So I put myself, one of the reasons why I ended up in Central Europe is that I was sitting around trying to figure out, okay, my contract is up in June of 1990. What am I going to do with my life? Because I'm halfway through my sophomore year. I've got like a 1.3 or something. Am I going to go back to some crappy state school that I don't really want to go to and sit in a class that bores me? What am I going to do? And I'd set aside, and this is the fortune of being born in 1968, I had set aside a period of time to make that decision, which was the Thanksgiving and Christmas breaks of 1989. Now, let's all put on our thinking caps. What was happening in Thanksgiving and Christmas of 1989?
Something with a wall, maybe, or
communism was collapsing on CNN, right? And all of my options were terrible. They really, because there was a recession there, the beginnings of one. It was the first time at that moment that journalism, newspaper industry started to finally go down after having 25% profit margins for 35 years. So all the options were bad. And then I was like, oh, hey, look, check it out. This is people my age are overthrowing communism because they don't like being told what kind of rock music they want to listen to or bands they want to be in. Maybe I'll go hang out with those guys. So I was very fortunate in that respect.
I'm curious how else your involvement in journalism helped to shape your political views. I know you didn't necessarily always consider yourself a libertarian. I know that, the label is not, I don't always embrace the label myself out there, but how did your involvement in your career shape your views along the way?
I mean, it's fundamental to my views in ways that I have a difficult time communicating to other libertarians. This is a strange. I've had this with I think Michael Malice and Adam Kokesh and a few other people, and just reason or readers, listeners, whatever, who will say, "Well, yeah, you're an evangelist for libertarian ideas," and I'll say, "No, actually, I'm not. It's part of the mission statement of Reason, and I'm definitely someone who is helping fulfill the mission statement of Reason and take it seriously to communicate libertarianism out there. But as a human being, as an individual little unit, I don't wake up in the morning thinking like, I am going to make my next door neighbor turn him into a libertarian. I don't. What I try to do is to spread to the best of my limited ability, and with all my flaws, add to the net amount of truth and usable, helpful insight, which could just even be like, here's a way of thinking about, here's a way to organize your thoughts around something, even if your thoughts disagree with my thoughts. I'll give you an example. A friend of mine who I knew in Budapest, worked on a newspaper together out there. He read a book I wrote about John McCain from 2007, 2008, McCain, The Myth of a Maverick, which was it was mostly a kind of ideological portrait of John McCain, who at the time was not being portrayed ideologically. He was the classic, he's just a problem solver. He's an American hero. He's just going to get things done, that kind of stuff. So my book went the other direction and kind of like, here's what he actually believes. And also, I think that a lot of those beliefs, when applied, lead to really bad policies and wars and things like that. So he reads this book, and he's got a Central European point of view, which informs my own, but isn't my own, and less over the years. But Central Europeans, especially in that part, tend to be way more interventionist, way more positive towards kind of American hegemony, because they experienced it better than almost anybody else did. They love Ronald Reagan. They thought that we were fighting the good fight in the Cold War, calling the evil empire by its name, and it mostly worked out for them from that point of view. But anyways, my friend Miklos said, I read your book, I really liked it, and after having read it, I like John McCain more and would have voted for him. And I'm like, awesome. That's what I'm here for. I'm here not to deliver your vote. I'm not here to cause you to change your mind. I'm here to deepen your understanding, your factual basis for wherever you go. And if I can get you in that way, maybe I will convince you of some aspects of things, and I'll be happy to convince you of those things. But the basis of my activity is to spread the net amount of truth and usable insight there. I think that overlaps very well with libertarianism, being as it is largely a marginal or outside of the usual kind of power structures analysis or way of looking at things, or ideology and what have you. And again, I think it is a useful way, especially to cover politics and government, because it forces you to ask all kinds of questions about the nature of why things are done that many people who are on the inside don't never occurs to them. But so I look at my mission as essentially journalistic, and I have this faith, naivete, confidence, something like that in the process of doing that, if I do that job well, then yes, it will be more persuasive for people in ways that will further the mission statements of reason and further, the spread of libertarian ideas. But in order for me to do that the best, my primary motivation has to be about truth.
Yeah, and I think whether it's through journalism or just in our daily conversations with people, when it comes to politics, you're just a lot less likely to have success influencing someone if they believe you're trying to shove an ideology down their throats. Whereas if you're just trying to provide a different perspective or try to provide the truth as you see it, you're more likely to at least pique their interest in something and maybe get them looking at things in a different way. Whereas if you just push your own ideology down their throats, they're much more likely to reject it and not even listening to, a portion of what you're trying to communicate.
So I come at things, I've already mentioned, or cast aspersions on the kind of pragmatic worldview. But in compared to all libertarians, I'm way more pragmatic than most in the sense that I don't arrive here via the non-aggression principle or via, a one-sentence philosophical statement or anything like that. I'm not philosophically moored as a person. This frustrates my anarchist friends, but that's where I come from. I didn't get there from there. And so I'm not going to pretend to be that guy, although I'm more that guy as time goes on for a variety of reasons. So, but it's frustrating for some people to encounter, let's say, me on television, and I will be on, Fox, doesn't really matter where, MSNBC, and it might be something having to do with the SEC's way of regulating X. And there will be some times when I'll say, what's the SEC doing? Why do we even have an SEC? But if you answer every question that way, if you answer every single question with like the fundamental line in the sand moral arguments of, well, we shouldn't even have X, you're going to be invited once. There is this fallen world that we live and play in. And yes, sometimes, and maybe too often, maybe all the time, by participating in that world, I am, or people like me are adding unnecessarily to its validity or its kind of purpose of being there without too often scratching the needle across the record and saying, hold on a second, we got to like start from scratch here. So yes, but at the same time, a key part of Reason, and this has been true, the magazine's been out now for 50 years, but very early on in its history, they had to decide, are we going to be an outreach magazine? Are we going to speak to audiences who aren't libertarians and try to expose them to libertarian ideas? Or are we going to be an in-house newsletter, fanning the flames and perfecting the ideology from within? Right. And we chose outreach, and that is completely copacetic with my worldview. So I try to get people there, and it's not just on TV; it's in the green room before and after too. Like we're kind of working the levers there. It's a great victory for me when I get a host on a fill-in-the-blank cable network who you wouldn't expect to make a completely kind of libertarian setup for an entire segment. I'm like, all right, I won here. I don't even have to say anything, right? But yes, long way of saying to engage in those kind of arguments in this kind of fallen world that we live in is a way that you get to keep being invited back. And so there's more of a libertarian voice than there would be otherwise if you just said, well, the government has no moral right to do X. Why are we even here?
I'm curious how you go about sort of presenting yourself and working your way into becoming a mainstream pundit, being someone that they see as, I guess, acceptable to appear on their program while still, sort of putting your views out there and trying to shift the conversation. Have you, sort of run into any issues on that end, or do you find yourself, pretty much welcome? You just seem to make a lot of appearances out there.
Well, it's a thing that I'll hear a lot. And it's not just on MSNBC, although I've been doing more there than elsewhere recently. But I would hear this, almost 10 years ago when I started doing this in earnest, like, oh, I never knew that I could like a libertarian or something along those lines.
Where's your neckbeard?
Yeah, partly it's because I don't force it into every conversation. That I'm happy to have a purely kind of journalistic analysis of things sometimes. Having, co-hosted a TV show and being sensitive to the needs of the medium, I appreciate the role that guests can play to just improve the overall quality of a broadcast and of the information being presented. So I'm trying to think of an example. About 9 months ago, there was some like Arizona lawmaker saying crazy thing type of story, which, it's evergreen. And they had the correspondent on from the ground talking about things. And I had prepared well enough, and I take journalism seriously enough, where I actually knew more than the correspondent on the ground. So instead of taking my time right there and saying, well, here's my clever libertarian argument for why, the government should be abolished, or whatever it might have been in that moment. And I don't remember really what it was. I think it was some kind of semi-racial dispute or something. It was, I limited my time to, oh, actually, here's this new development to the story. Here is a way to correct what your correspondent just said without calling them amateurish, but, just to try to improve the overall quality. Hosts and producers really appreciate that. There are times when I'll be on the set next to an anchor, and they'll be interviewing a newsmaker remotely, a congressperson or something like that. And I will hastily scribble out a question and say, oh, I ask this person that. There's a time when I did that on the Melissa Harris Perry show, which I used to love going on the weekends on MSNBC, which might surprise people to hear that. But she was really a very interesting broadcaster, and she was very open to different ideas and conversations. But we had the family member of someone who'd been involved in a police, I think, death or some kind of thing like that. And I really helped in the moment help her ask questions that ended up making news and making the segment much more worthwhile. I love doing that. I mean, it's just journalism. This is why this is what got me to fall in love with this thing 32 years ago. So it's a combination of those things. I know that sometimes it's really great to bring an overhand, right cross to the chopper and scream at Stuart Varney on Fox Business about like why, you shouldn't make jokes about stoners being arrested. And like, don't ever bore me with your BS about limited government if you believe putting 700,000 people in human meat lockers, because if you do that too. But like to have a mix of approaches available to you, knowing that you are putting yourself in position to help the producers and to help the anchors, I think is the best way to do things.
Hey friends, I got to take a quick pause here to tell you about another great libertarian podcast out there. It's called Free Man Beyond the Wall, hosted by the artist formerly known as Mance Rayder, now known simply by his real name of Pete Raymond. And I got to tell you, Pete is a machine. This guy brings you a new episode of his own every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, and he has done some absolutely fantastic in-depth interviews. He's had on everybody from Ron Paul to Thaddeus Russell to Phil Labonte, the lead singer of All That Remains. A very diverse group of guests, not always libertarians. He also did a great show with a Washington, D.C. insider lobbyist revealing a lot of the dirt that goes on behind the scenes in DC. He has done so many interviews that I have just said, darn, I wish I did this one myself. So I really do want to highly recommend checking out Free Man Beyond the Wall. You can find it over at freemanbeyondthewall.com, as well as iTunes, Stitcher, and all those fancy podcatchers out there. Matt, I want to switch gears a little bit and talk about the political arm of the libertarian movement. Of course, the Libertarian Party, which you cover at Reason. And at the LNC last year, the vice chair debate, you were one of the hosts of that debate, and you asked a great question. It was based on something Tom Woods had said at the Mises Caucus event. And Tom stated something to the effect of that the Libertarian Party would be much better off getting 1 million voters who had their lives changed than 70 million voters who just, maybe went to the booth and ticked a box and didn't really change their views too much. So I'm kind of curious where you fall on that position, on that strategy-wise when it comes to the Libertarian Party. Should they be aiming to just get votes, or to really just change the hearts and minds?
That's my classic punt on this is yes.
Well, I don't think that's a punt. I think that's any realistic take on the situation would see that there's not necessarily a divide between one or the other here. You can, in fact, do both. It's just about the approach.
And I think you kind of have to. It's I once gave a talk. Rand Paul was nice enough to invite me to come and speak to a bunch of interns on Capitol Hill. And the topic was, how do we get to libertarian social change? How do we achieve libertarian victories? And I forget exactly what I went through. I think I went through recognizing the Second Amendment as an individual right, gay marriage stuff, weed legalization. And at that point, I think we were almost ready to declare some kind of small victory in like the U.S. not getting involved in the shooting war in Syria, which Rand Paul had a lot to do with in 2013. Anyways, those and other ones, they all came about in like wildly different ways. There were people working this super long libertarian legal game, 30, 40-year project of scholarship and a bunch of other things besides. Ellen DeGeneres has as much to do with why gay marriage is now legally recognized and why we don't tolerate discrimination based on sexual orientation in marriage things, just because she came out in the 90s and that was kind of a big deal. And like the culture changed. So there's so many different ways to do things. And I think there's so many different ways to do things electorally. And there's a mistaken tendency, or a tendency that's a mistake, to always be looking for the Hail Mary, the big bomb, the one thing. I'm going to win the election. We're finally going to get our president in, and that's going to change everything. I think a lot of libertarians have flirted with, prematurely loving mass political movements that didn't turn out to be their friends after all. You're seeing this, I think, with the yellow vests in France and with Brexit and with with Hungary right now. I mean, to see a libertarian praise Viktor Orban, a guy who I covered for 3 years in the mid 1990s, makes me want to vomit up a squirrel. He's absolutely no friend to liberty or no friend to humanity. But so I think that even in the narrow field of electoral politics that the Libertarian Party has to play, you have to do it in a bunch of different ways. In fact, I like the fact that there are state variants on this. I mean, the Libertarian Party of Florida they're all about like, screw the governor, screw Senate and stuff. We're going to get the local water boards, the nonpartisan Mickey Mouse things. We're going to build from the ground up. I think that's great that there's a party that's focusing on that, and that there's another state party, maybe Indiana, I don't know, who focuses on things a different way. I think that's all part of the blend. So since I tend to be more like a pragmatic and a squish and a big tent and an outreach type of person, my natural inclination is to go in the direction of the 70 million votes or the wider possible thing rather than the white hot philosophical, like I'm going to change the way that you think about everything. But in fact, I really think that the ultimate thing in a Hayekian way of like, there is no one true way, that's even true within the narrow category of electoral politics. So you got to do it all kind of at the same time and keep yourself semi-viable and semi in the game. And for all other things that the LP has done wrong, and for all the things that they're going to do wrong in the near future, I am confident it's the third party in America. That's an achievement. That is something that's happened. And a great question right now that we're going to find out over the next 20 months is that what it is? Or did that just kind of coincide with some things that went in the LP's direction and might be undone? I tend to think that's where it's going to be and stay, but we don't know. Politics is in a weird place right now.
Oh, well, let's explore that direction a little bit more, because almost any conversation relating to the Libertarian Party and 2020 over the last 2 years has involved the name Bill Weld. And you recently interviewed Bill Weld at LibertyCon. And during the interview, he mentioned that he'll be involved in the Libertarian Party, or he'll be involved in 2020, I guess is what he actually said. And he even referred to the Libertarian Party as we. And then I think it was like the next day is when it was reported that he had changed his registration to Republican. Now, in full disclosure, we're recording this prior to the, I guess, planned announcement that Bill Weld is going to make on the 15th. So by the time this airs, it will have already occurred. So maybe we can see how good your predictive qualities are here. But what do you think of Bill Weld, and where do you think he's going? Do you think this is all just a bunch of brouhaha over him supposedly switching his party registration, or do you think he's actually going to do something which I think would be silly and crazy and try to primary Donald Trump? I mean, where do you think this is all going?
My prediction is that he will announce on Friday, which is February 15th at the Politics and Eggs Breakfast in New Hampshire, that he will announce that he's intending to run in the New Hampshire primary against Donald Trump as a way to stop him and to challenge and to have old-timey Republican values or conservative values of free trade and a more open immigration system and et cetera, be part of the national conversation. I think that he's doing this. If he wasn't doing this, he could have denied it already. You mentioned that I interviewed him on at LibertyCon. He had changed his party registration 2 days before that interview.
Oh, it was before that? Oh, I see.
2 days before. Yeah, it's amazing.
Did you know about that at the time, or did that not come out?
I did not. And in fact, to my discredit, there was some reporting that came. The first article about him maybe thinking about going Republican came out a couple of days later, I think in the Boston Herald. And on Twitter, I'm like, yeah, I don't think that's happening, because I've watched him on the Libertarian Party circuit for 15 months. Do endorsements. He was doing dozens and dozens of endorsements. He was speaking at various places. He was talking really specifically using the royal we, and I'm a libertarian for life. And
I know he was a max donor on several libertarian campaigns. He was definitely getting involved heavily.
And so, but in watching the Weld World comments to the Boston Press and other people like that, I can easily see the mindset as being something like this. Look, no one else is running against him. John Kasich has a contributor deal for CNN. He might not, he doesn't really sound like he's exactly there yet. Howard Schultz is still only talking about it as an independent, but there's no primary competitor. And there's a theory of the case, both in terms of someone who could actually compete against him or someone who could hurt him. The theory of the hurt of the case is that every incumbent who faced a serious, or at least a challenger to make him sweat, Jimmy Carter in 1980 with Ted Kennedy, George H.W. Bush with Pat Buchanan in 92, Lyndon Johnson and Eugene McGovern in 68. So all those incumbents either lose or quit. So someone needs to do the work to wipe him out. And also, we don't know what's going to happen with the Mueller investigation. Interesting to point out that Mueller used to work for Bill Weld. And so he's got his own kind of rule of law rap against Trump as well. Plus, Weld is from the Northeast, so he knows people in in New England, and that theoretically could help him, though people have known him long enough that he's switched teams so many times that he's kind of been the boy who cried wolf. And more importantly here, or most importantly, there's the calendar. Libertarians are going to decide their president in May 2020. We have a presidential campaign, national, that's completely underway right now. Howard Schultz is going to have a CNN town hall tonight. People are falling over themselves on the Democratic side, endorsing the Green New Deal. Like, it's on right now. So you could sit back on your hands and wait for the LP thing to come through. Or you could say, you know what? What happens if Trump gets impeached and there's no one else running for president? Maybe I'll be the guy who ran for president. I'll be the only one there. Larry Hogan's not in there yet. No one else is in there. So I could see his theory of the case. And this is all speculative on my part. I haven't talked to him directly about that, but It's informed speculation because I know him and his world pretty well. You get to be in that conversation, and he loves being in the middle of conversations. And he probably thinks, and this is where I think he's probably wrong, he probably thinks that even if he does this and he becomes the splat on the windshield, which is the most likely outcome of any such thing for anyone running against Trump in the Republican primary, that he can maybe go back to the Libertarian Party afterwards.
He can't think that. Does he really think that?
It's possible that he thinks that he could do that, at least for a vice presidential nod. I don't think that that's a real thing. But again, politics change. Politics are so dynamic right now. We have no idea what this all is going to look like. So, maybe there's a possibility that you or I can't fathom of him being welcomed back. But I'd see a lot of libertarians like, no, not again.
Well, no, especially because, after his whole statement that he was a libertarian for life, he's not going anywhere. To switch and come back again would just be mind-blowing. But I suppose anything's possible nowadays.
Yeah.
Matt, one more thing I wanted to ask you about, but before I leave off with you here, and I know you don't really get too directly involved in politics in the activity sense. You're not a member of the party, or as far as I know, or you're not involved in any way outside of journalism, but I'm curious if you were not a journalist, if you maybe never became a journalist, but still became a libertarian, or maybe you just retire from Reason tomorrow for whatever reason, what sort of libertarian activism could you see yourself involved in if you had no journalistic ties at all?
That's really interesting. I would guess that it would have something to do with criminal justice reform type of efforts, just trying to get individual people out from the crosshairs of unsupportable, as the French would say, insupportable carceral state, individual acts of injustice. If we can, in journalism too, Reason we helped get a guy off death row, and that's one of the proudest accomplishments of the organization during my tenure there. If we can actually just improve a single person's life and get like Ross Ulbricht out of jail, if we can do things like that to tangibly reverse an injustice and free a human being, that speaks to me on a fundamental level. I think that we should all be doing more of that, and I probably even have some guilt that I don't spend more time on such things. So if I was going to be, professionally libertarian and not a journalist, it would be like that. But if I'm being honest, if I wasn't doing journalism, I'd be playing shitty Chicago songs in some bar in upstate New York. I would be the world's worst cover band musician and drink myself to death.
Well, there's still plenty of time, Matt. So
it's important to have goals.
Don't let your dreams die. That's my advice. Matt, thank you so much for joining me today. It's been an absolute blast having you on. I'm sure I'd love to have you back once again down the road, especially as we continue to cover the always interesting Libertarian Party races and politics and all that great stuff. So it's been a pleasure having you on. Before I let you go, why don't you just give a little wrap up of how people can find you on social media, your work at Reason. Feel free to plug away on anything else you got going on.
Great. So thank you again for this conversation. Really
Absolutely.
Fun and started drone on. So find me at Reason. Reason.com is there, as hopefully you all know, and you can follow Reason on Twitter at Reason. My Twitter follow is at Matt Welch. Also, I'm part of the Fifth Column podcast, which you can find at We the Fifth, spell out fifth. And that's good enough for starters out there. I write a monthly column for the LA Times, but I link to that at my own feed. So you start there and say hi and say howdy and make me laugh on Twitter, and I will follow you and we can all be friends.
Matt, thanks so much for coming on. Keep up the great work. Keep on roaring.
Thank you, man.
All right, kids, I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Matt Welch as much as I did, and it turns out his prediction was accurate. As you all know, Bill Weld did, in fact, announce that he is running for president in the Republican primary against Donald Trump. Personally, I don't know if that's going to go anywhere or really be of any interest to libertarians, other than the fact that at one point 2 years ago, for a brief period in time, this gentleman happened to call himself one. But as we do with everything, one of the most fun times in our lives, honestly, I think we all agree on this, that those of us that are active in this podcast, my fellow hosts, as well as Rico, Howie, and JB, were when we were covering the presidential debates in 2016. It was kind of close to, not that far away from the beginning of the podcast. We're probably, I guess we're kind of podcasting teenagers at that point, I would say. And we watched every single Republican debate, every single Democratic debate. We did a ton of podcasts about them, and we are absolutely going to be doing that in this coming election season. There have been 20 Democratic debates announced. I'm not kidding. 20 Democratic debates. I don't know exactly the form that our coverage will be in, but they will likely be in the form of libertarians in living rooms drinking liquor style roundtables where we discuss, whatever goes on at these debates. Exactly whose show they'll be on, we don't really know. Some of that might be in the form of live streams that, only the Patreon people can access at first, and perhaps they'll be released later on. We don't know, but when that schedule comes out, we're going to put our brains together and start figuring out how we're going to provide you the libertarian drunken takes on election coverage that you have come to know and love from us. So stay tuned for all that in the coming year. And if you just can't get enough Lions of Liberty, well, check out our Patreon. Once again, patreon.com/Lions of Liberty, where we'll have all sorts of bonus content, including, I'm sure, a lot of coverage and behind-the-scenes stuff related to our coverage of those Democratic primary debates. And, of course, don't forget to tune in this coming Wednesday to my man Brian McWilliams and his wonderful, wonderful, lovely, not as curse-filled as it used to be program, Electric Liberty Land, as well as John wrapping things up this coming Friday with his incredibly hard-hitting look at the broken criminal justice system. And don't forget, today's episode of Lions of Liberty has been brought to you by mathbot.com. The pen may be mightier than the sword, but code is even mightier than the pen. You can learn how to build the tools that will bring prosperity and freedom to the world by learning how to code over at mathbot.com. That's mathbot.com. Become mighty, my friends. And until next time, live long and live free.